Every important news story has multiple, valuable perspectives. So why rely on just one or two sources for staying informed? That's why I use Ground News. It's a website and app that combines thousands of news articles from around the world into one place every single day. Ground News shows you how different outlets are covering the same story, so you can compare perspectives and avoid blind spots in your news diet. One feature I find especially valuable is the bias bar. It puts news coverage in context, giving you a visual breakdown of how news sources across the political spectrum are covering a story. So if you want to broaden your news horizons and get a more complete picture of current events, go check out ground.news. And if you like what you find, you can use my link in the show notes to get 15% off any subscription. Your support helps this podcast and promotes media literacy. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And the decline of the two-parent household in America is reshaping our society. But why is this decline happening? What are its consequences? And why are so many of us reluctant to discuss it? Our guest this week has spent years studying America's changing family structure, how it's widening inequality, and limiting opportunity for millions of kids. Melissa Kearney is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. She is also director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Melissa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. A couple years ago, I spoke with Richard Reeves. He's a colleague of yours at the Brookings Institution about his book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. It remains one of my favorite conversations, and Richard is such a meticulous, thoughtful, and empathetic person who focuses on inequality and how to help those in need. And when he saw that young men were struggling in pretty much every avenue of life, falling behind in academic achievement, job earnings, mortality, he thought he'd investigate and write a book about it. And a lot of academics he knew and respected came out and said, quote, this is Richard talking now, "Don't do it. It's not worth the risk," end quote. You too have written extensively on social policy and inequality, and that ultimately led you to write your book titled The Two-Parent Privilege, How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. And in this book, you write, quote, "I anticipate some measure of backlash from well-meaning people who think it is impolite or impolitic to apply an unforgiving tool like economic analysis on the family. But when I look at the data and evidence that have piled up over decades and across disciplinary fields, I am convinced that it is a conversation people in the U.S. need to have," end quote. And you anticipated correctly. So in the spirit of treating Brookings Institution colleagues equally, I'll put the same question to you I put to Richard. Why?
So let me say, Richard is a friend, and I have great admiration for Richard, and also think, like you, that his book is a terrific contribution to public discourse. So I'm flattered to be asked the same question that you asked him. There's two elements. Why did I think both of us anticipate backlash? I think that reflects the circles that Richard and I tend to run in, which, are sort of more left-leaning, think tank type conversations. In those circles, saying things like boys are struggling could be misinterpreted as you're not sufficiently worried about girls. Calling attention to the importance of family sounds very socially conservative and judgy. And so in the world of left-leaning think tanks and higher ed, this sounds a little harsh, but it's not the right narrative, I would say, about why certain groups are falling behind, why inequality is widening. And I have spent lots of my intellectual energy and policy work time arguing in favor of the more typical things you'd expect from someone from Brookings to write about: the need for a stronger safety net, the need for more resources to low-income families. I believe all of that is critically important, but the data and evidence really is overwhelming that families, home life, family structure is so determinant of kids' trajectories in life that we could just keep talking about schools and the safety net, but we are swimming upstream against this really strong current of the decline in the two-parent family. And we're just going to be treating the symptoms of that underlying problem. And, why did I write the book? I felt like this really needed to be part of the conversation and part of the policy agenda and not just left to the culture wars.
And you've said that when you actually talk to those most affected by the decline in the two-parent family, whether it's groups that work with single parents or the parents themselves, you don't get that same reaction. You don't get that same, oh, we shouldn't talk about this reaction. And this seems to be a repeated pattern I've noticed. And honestly, if I'm being upfront with you, Melissa, one that is increasingly upsetting me. I've seen it with Richard. I've seen it with you. I've seen it with other well-meaning people who care and write about the most critical issues in life. A disconnect between how people in academia feel and talk about these issues and how people who are on the ground living these issues as actual realities feel about them. So what's causing this disconnect?
This has been super interesting and frankly bolstering to me in the sense that I did have some trepidation putting out the book. And when I wrote it, for your listeners who haven't read the book, it shouldn't be controversial at all. And I think I don't really say anything that would surprise people who have the experience of raising kids or growing up with parents, right? But why it's controversial is just really to highlight the role of family. And that's a message that itself is controversial, even though the research isn't controversial. So I was nervous. And then what was interesting is before the book came out, I presented all of the research in it actually at a population demographic conference over in Europe. And there were a lot of European economists and demographers, and they were shocked at my sort of message of like, hey, look at what's happened to the share of kids living in one-parent homes. Look at how disadvantaged they are, how much worse their outcomes are. And one woman came up to me. She's like, I can't even believe you'd write this book. We would never say this in Europe. This is so anti-feminist. It was really interesting to me. And I was like, well, you know what? The European situation, you guys are behind us in the sense of the rate of non-marital childbearing and single-parent households is rising in Europe, but it's still much farther behind in US. So I was like, take a lesson from the US. This is not a feminist success story. And then a couple weeks later, I presented the same research, the same data at a conference of people who work on the front lines fighting poverty in this country. And I was in a breakout session with a lot of groups that work with single moms. Many of these providers are single moms themselves. And I have to tell you, I felt a bit like an idiot showing data like, oh, look, married moms have more time to read with their kids than single moms. And I'm also nervous about how this is coming across. And afterwards, it was amazing. The single moms in the group and the women who work with single moms, they basically saw me as telling their story. And what they were saying is, yeah, of course I don't have as much time as the woman who has a husband who's working and mowing the lawn. I'm doing all of that by myself. And they felt heard. They didn't need national data sets to tell them that their job was harder than for people who have two parents in the household. They weren't offended. And some of them were like, I never really thought about why we're in this situation. And one of my big themes is college-educated women, higher income women, they're the least likely to find themselves raising kids alone. But that is a luxury for us to be able to sit around at think tanks and in universities and think about why that's the case. The vulnerable populations who are living with these challenges, they're just actually living with the hard reality. So I think it's a bit of an indictment of those of us in what is sometimes referred to condescendingly as the chattering class, that we're so nervous about offending somebody else that we don't really tell the truth or acknowledge their realities of struggle.
I'm trying to formulate this question through my simmering rage here, because I try to stay largely as objective as I can on this show. But when it comes to children and having grown up in a home where I had two parents who loved me and my sister very much, who made a conscious effort to be there for us, because my mom came from a broken home. My dad came from a situation that I don't think any child would want as well, even though his parents were married. Their marriage was very dysfunctional. And yet my parents came from those backgrounds and then did the right thing for my sister and I. And when I hear my mom tell stories of her parents' divorce, and when I hear my dad tell stories of the chaos that he experienced as a child, and then to see what they did to give my sister and I a good life. When I hear what you're saying, Melissa, about how academics, and I know this isn't everyone because I'm speaking to an academic right now, but when a large amount of academics are more concerned about sounding good and not offending, by the way, to your point, not offending the people who are actually struggling with this issue, but actually just offending their peers who are unaffected by it. When you're more worried about causing offense than you are to solving problems and helping people who are in need, I feel like we should deploy shame. I feel like we should make these people, and I am sorry, if you've listened to other episodes of my podcast, Melissa, you know that I'm not one to make strong statements like this, but I feel like we should make these people feel ashamed of themselves, if I'm being quite honest.
So, okay, two things. One, I tend to ascribe good motives to people, and I think a lot of it is well-meaning. I just think it's completely misguided. And where I get irate as a social scientist is when people are sort of burying what we know is true in the data because it's not the preferred narrative. Like that, to me, you can't call yourself a scholar if you're not willing to say, hey, actually, this is what the data say. It might be inconvenient, but this is the truth, and let's grapple with that. So that's actually where I get irate. But I do think, right, most people, they're well-meaning in not wanting to offend people, but it's just very counterproductive. Okay, the second thing I will say, if you haven't had him on your podcast yet, he's amazing, which is Rob Henderson. Have you seen his book or heard him?
He was one of the very first guests on this show.
So I think he put a great label on this.
Luxury beliefs.
There's some great shaming happening there. And it's just beautiful because it's coming from Rob Henderson, who you certainly can't accuse Rob Henderson of not having the lived experience to tell this story. And so he's just such a national treasure, an amazing story, right? For a kid who grew up in such dysfunction, bounced around from foster care to now have the poise and the success to be able to tell his story and just say, hey, in my experience, I got all the education in the world, which is what you elite people tell me I should do. And I know firsthand that that will never give me what a stable family life would have given me. And in many ways, it was just a serendipitous that our books came out around the same time because I'm telling the story in data. Two-parent families are really protective of kids. You know, I think his calling out is pretty stigmatizing of that tendency. But again, I don't want to suggest that the tendency is largely reflective of dishonesty or cowardice. I think a lot of it comes from well-meaning people. I just think it's really misguided and counterproductive.
Yes. I don't want to linger too long on this because I want to dig into the book, but I would say it feels like there's almost an appearance to wanting to seem well-intentioned, well-meaning sometimes. Because I've spoken with Rob. I've also spoken with Bertrand Cooper. He himself raised by a single mother in a literal crack house. And his experience is going to school in Rutgers and Rob's experience going to school at Yale and later Cambridge are almost identical in that when both of them spoke with people from the upper class about their experiences growing up working class or poor, there was a complete mismatch between how people in the upper class spoke about the quote unquote working class and the poor, and then their actual lived experiences. And what people like Bertrand and Rob were saying, hey, here's what would be best for us. It's interesting because sometimes someone like Rob or Bertrand would say, hey, this is what I know what would have been good for me as a child. And the person on the other end of that conversation who grew up in privilege would be offended by something that Rob or Bertrand said. And so to me, and again, like I can take a harsher tone here, Melissa, because these aren't necessarily my peers. And also to be fair to you, I don't know them. So I know that most of these people are very well-meaning. But to me, if someone came and said, hey, there's asbestos in this apartment complex and it's hurting the people living inside. And the reaction to that data was, well, we don't want to offend the people who are doing their best living in that apartment complex. You're like, well, no, maybe the more important thing is the asbestos.
Right. You know, the analogy that I make is we have a conversation in this country all the time about how do we get more people to go to college and get through college and succeed in college, because we know a college degree yields an earnings premium in the labor market. People who hold college degrees have lower unemployment rates. They have higher earnings. There's careful research showing that that's causal. It's not just about the selection of people who go to college, but even people who, through sort of, you know, small shocks, wind up at a flagship school versus not going to school or going to community college. They have better labor market outcomes. So we're honest about that data. And then we have lots of policy conversations, lots of policy initiatives focused on helping people get through college. We don't say, shh, you're shaming the people who don't have a college degree. Like, that's not nice. Let's not talk about how to help them. We should be having the same conversation about family structure. It is undeniable and in the data. And all the critics who have come out against my book, like, nobody refutes the evidence or the data on this point that it is undeniable that kids who grow up with the benefit of two parents in their home, which is basically married parents, those are tightly linked in this country. Kids who grow up with that benefit have higher resources in their childhood that leads to better educational outcomes, that leads to better outcomes as adults. So we need to be having the conversation of how do we help more families achieve that very beneficial family structure without worrying that let's not talk about that because that makes people who don't have that family structure feel bad. And again, to your point, the people who don't have that family structure, we're not kidding them. They know it's really hard. They know they're at a disadvantage relative to the families who have two parents pouring their resources and time into their kids. And so we should be able to have that same conversation.
Speaking of data, let's talk about it. From your book, quote, "The share of American children growing up with the benefit of two parents in their home is at a historic low. In 2019, nearly 40% of American children did not live with married parents. Nearly 20% of American children lived with only their mother, with no second parent figure in the home," end quote. That is a staggering statistic, and it gets worse depending on the demographic, but it hasn't always been that way, right?
No, this is really a story of the past 40 years and more recent than that for some of the groups. In 1980, the biggest change has been in the middle, what I call the middle of the education distribution. You can think of this as the middle class, moms who have a high school degree. In 1980, 83% of their kids lived in married parent homes. So a bit less than among kids whose moms had a four-year college degree. It was 90%. But fast forward 40 years, 4 decades, and for that group, that's the majority of moms, only 60% of their kids live in married parent homes. And so this is the really underappreciated story. It's not just the most disadvantaged groups, teen moms, for example, women without a high school degree. It's not just in those demographic groups that we have the challenge of single mother households. The spread of non-marital childbearing and what's come as a consequence of that single mother households has really spread to a much wider segment of the population in ways that I don't think are fully appreciated by those, I'll stick with your theme of this, who have the luxury of living in neighborhoods and in populations where people are largely still raising their kids in two-parent, married parent homes at similar rates to the past. So that's really the big story. That's been driving the change. The other really, I think, critical trend that is underappreciated is that now the gap is a college gap, as I call it. So again, it's not just the most disadvantaged, vulnerable groups in society standing apart from the rest of society by having high rates of single parenthood. It's really now the college educated who are standing apart by still raising their kids almost entirely in married parent homes. And that's why I lean so heavily into this concept of marriage and advantage. It's the most advantaged, privileged groups in society that are still achieving this very stable, protective, advantageous family structure in similar rates, and everybody else is falling behind. And so for all of the talk and concern about, rising inequality and the hoarding of resources and advantages of the top, this is yet another one. And it should bother all of us who care about equity, that two-parent family has now become another luxury good of the college-educated class. That's really the story in the data.
Going back to Rob Henderson, you recently sat down with him to talk through this issue. He was the first person who brought the huge class divide in marriage rates to my attention back in 2020. In our conversation, he said, quote, "In 1960, the vast majority of children in rich and poor families lived with both parents. By 2005, 85% of kids in affluent families still lived with both parents. For kids in working class families, it dropped to 30%, 30, end quote." What I'm trying to figure out here, Melissa, as an outsider, as a non-academic, as someone who was recently married myself.
Oh, congratulations.
Well, thank you. Best decision I ever made. Getting married isn't particularly hard. I'm not saying like if you want like a dream wedding or something, that's affordable. But I mean the actual act of getting married. That's not hard. And when I say that, I want to clarify here. I mean compared to other things like acquiring wealth or getting a college degree or a high status job. Those can take years of concentrated effort and drive to attain. Like becoming a doctor, that's like a decade plus of work. But getting married at the end of the day, it's just a choice, like a choice to commit and to stay committed. It's not like ancient wisdom or like a dead language, like learning Sanskrit or something. But many Americans, as you've noted, are still getting married at very high rates, just in the upper class, just in the college educated level. So why did these two cohorts disconnect if ultimately getting married is simply a choice?
It is a choice, but marriage is predicated on ideally a healthy relationship with someone you're compatible with. I don't want to be flip about it. And this is why I think thinking about it as getting a college degree is a little bit appropriate in the sense that finding and maintaining a healthy relationship that is rewarding, it takes commitment. It is a choice, but it's a choice that has become more, let's say, attractive and achievable for certain segments of society. So the story I tell in the book, based on my read of lots of data and, hundreds of studies on this, is the following. In the 60s and 70s, we had this social cultural revolution, the imperative to get married, the imperative to have kids within marriage, the imperative to have sex within marriage, that all became unbundled right through, as economists call it, like technological shocks. You had the pill, abortion legalization, these things that led to a separation of having kids and marriage. And there was a reconsideration of gender norms, all of this. We know the story of the 60s and 70s. And what did we see happen to marriage rates? They declined a bit, basically uniformly across the education distribution. And then you went into the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and marriage stopped declining among the college educated, and it kept declining among everybody else. So what happened? Well, there's lots of economic evidence now that going into the 80s and 90s, there were large economic disruptions that were very beneficial to college educated workers and harmful to the economic position of workers without a college degree, men in particular. And so that made a lot of these men less attractive as marriage partners if their economic position was weaker, at the same time that women were more equipped and had better opportunities to provide for themselves. So I unabashedly think it's a good thing that women no longer have to enter into marriages they might not want to be in to have any semblance of financial security. But the reality of marriage is that, okay, this is going to sound very unromantic, especially to someone who just got married, but it is a long-term economic contract to join with another person, commit to be together in the long term, to pool your resources, to produce a household, and if it's appropriate for you, kids, to do all that together in a shared sense. And the attractiveness of tying yourself to someone who, is not that attractive as an economic partner, that changes the calculus against a backdrop where it's now more socially acceptable to both not be married and to have kids outside marriage. That's true across the board, but it becomes even more acceptable in certain segments of society where it becomes increasingly common. And so, I think we're stuck in this really terrible cycle where the economic attractiveness or imperative of marriage was eroded at the same time as social norms and legal institutions and conventions that promoted marriage are also weakened. And so that's how I read why the population's segmented in this way.
I was just reading a Brookings Institution policy brief from 1996, co-authored by our now current Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. And it echoed what you just said about reproductive technology playing a large role in the decoupling between having children and getting married, but also the precipitous decline in shotgun weddings and why that was such an important social element of causing people to get married. I want to read just a snippet from that quote. What links liberalized contraception and abortion with the declining shotgun marriage rate? Before 1970, the stigma of unwed motherhood was so great that few women were willing to bear children outside of marriage. The only circumstance that would cause women to engage in sexual activity was a promise of marriage in the event of pregnancy, end quote. And then it said, quote, The increased availability of contraception and abortion made shotgun weddings a thing of the past. Women who were willing to get an abortion or who reliably used contraception no longer found it necessary to condition sexual relations on a promise of marriage in the event of pregnancy, but women who wanted children, who did not want an abortion for moral or religious reasons, or who were unreliable in their use of contraception, found themselves pressured to participate in premarital sexual relations without being able to exact a promise of marriage in case of pregnancy, end quote. And it goes on to say how basically this pre-reproductive technology era meant that if a man got a woman pregnant, there was a huge social pressure, social stigma to be like, all right, this is on you. You have to marry this girl. Now, obviously, that led to a lot of bad marriages. If you're not entering a marriage with a conscious choice of, I want to spend the rest of my life with this person, and instead are like, oh my God, what have I done? We need to get married. That's not always the best way to set yourself up for success. But I imagine that idea that, oh my God, if we get pregnant, we have to get married was acting as a kind of preventative to be like, all right, let's make sure that if we get pregnant, we want to get married. And it was just really interesting to see the major role that something like the existence of a shotgun wedding, which is basically foreign to us in 2024, what a big role that played in getting people married and preventing unwanted pregnancies.
It's such a great paper, that 1996 study. I think it really encapsulates the way economists think about these kinds of issues, which might be foreign to some people who are like, wait, why do economists study all this anyway? These kinds of decisions are really fundamental to families and households, which are the key unit of society and the economy. And so this is very much in our purview. And the way we think about this is we take conditions, we take prices, we take constraints, we take preferences, which are shaped by prevailing norms. And we think about people primarily as rational actors making decisions within those contexts. And then we take, really cutting edge econometric approaches to testing those models and ideas with data. There's so much of that in that paper, which says, look, if the rules of the game are changed, you're going to get different outcomes. And so that's exactly the situation when there's this technology shock. And there are others. I mean, that paper focuses on the availability of pill, the availability of abortion. You could move forward a couple of decades and start talking about unilateral divorce. Once the rules of the game, the contract, the understandings is changed, people will make different choices. And we think of them as constrained choices, right? You're making choices given what's available to you.
There's a word or words that are tossed around in academia a lot that I feel can be really alienating to the average person because I don't know, almost feels like a monkish chant at this point, like structures, structural, systemic. But when I think academics are talking about these things, they're talking about exactly what you're saying here. The existence or non-existence of reproductive technology, the existence or non-existence of the pressure of a shotgun marriage. That's what academics mean when they're talking about structural forces that affect human behavior, right?
Right. So let me tell another structural story, which is you live in a community where everyone graduates high school. The guys can expect to go work at the manufacturing plant, have a really nice union job, family sustaining wage. He's confident in his ability to provide for a family. You're confident in his ability to provide for you. You get married and you have a couple kids. Okay. Then you fast forward 25 years and these structural forces are such that manufacturing plant closes. And that was the main employer in town. Now there's really not much for those high school educated guys to be doing. So some of them move into lower paying jobs. Maybe they've got building services, maybe groundskeeping, maybe food services. Some of them leave the workforce. You find yourself in a relationship, you find yourself pregnant. You're right, shotgun marriage is no longer an institution. You've got a waitressing job. You can keep a roof over your head, but it's not going to be easy. But do you want to marry this guy? Maybe he doesn't even want to get married. Maybe he takes off. Those are structural forces. And that's why, I come at this very empathetic. That is a real situation. We actually know in the data that in places, in communities that were hit by import competition from low-wage countries that drove out jobs, that were heavily invested in certain types of industries that then adopted robots, and that led to job loss among non-college educated workers. We know in those communities that what happened as a result was a reduction in marriage and a rise in the share of kids living outside a two-parent or a married parent home. So those are the kind of structural forces I have in mind. This is why it's both economics and social norms. Because one thing you could say to me is there were always poor people and they still got married. You're like, yes, the institution might not have been so attractive as an economic proposition, or it might have even been more imperative, but the social norms were such that, of course, if you wanted to have kids, you'd get married. And so once you've got an erosion of both the economic forces and the social norms, it's a bit tragic and it's going to be hard to get out of, but we are stuck in a paradigm that is really not good for kids. So having said all that, I want to bring up another issue, which is that now that it is so prevalent and really not stigmatized at all, and in some ways even celebrated as a feminist success story for people to be raising their kids outside two-parent homes, there are some families, I can't quantify which bucket are the single-parent families fall into, but there are some families where it's like, I got pregnant, this guy doesn't make me really happy every day, or this woman doesn't make me really happy every day, or I still want to go find my passion. And those people are making choices that are, I think, less reflective of difficult economic realities and more reflective of social norms that make it okay for adults to prioritize their own happiness over what might be best for their kids. And that's a pretty big statement for me as a social scientist to say that's not the kind of thing I usually write. But a lot of the pushback I've been getting from my book is, well, you come out and say you favor, a social norm of two-parent households for kids, that restricts people's freedoms. And I'm like, yes, actually. And once you have a kid, in my mind, you have an obligation to that child. And so then, I say this as a parent too, your best wishes for what makes you happy every day. Are we really okay living in a society where that just dominates what is clearly in the best interest of kids? And so I do think there are some difficult conversations to be had around that. And then finally, having said that, let me be very, very clear. Nothing I'm saying should be misconstrued to suggest that anybody should stay in an abusive situation. That's not good for anybody, kids included, and I would never advocate for that.
Yes. I mean, I'm really glad that you said this, especially with your background and as an economist. We have to say full-throatedly, I think, when you put your own needs before your child, you are being selfish and you're being a bad parent because the child can't fend for themselves. There's a story you share in the book about a time when you were in a cab in Boston and you noticed a photo of a young girl displayed on the driver's dashboard. What happened next?
I asked him, oh, is that your daughter? And he was like, oh, yes. Yeah. And he was like, obviously really proud as a dad. And he's like, oh, I have more pictures you want to see. And he hands me his phone so I could scroll through. And I study this kind of stuff, these issues. And so I couldn't help myself. So I was like, I know this is nosy, but I'm an economist and I study families. Can I just ask, do you live with her? There was something about the way he was talking that made me think he didn't. He's like, no, she lives with her mom. I was like, oh, out of curiosity, can I ask why you're not together? And he's like, well, we talk about it. And maybe if we save up enough money, we'll get married. Like it was clear that they were in a romantic relationship, but he was just sort of ambivalent about whether they got married or not. And I said, you seem like you get along with the mom. You seem like you really love your daughter. Why don't you live together as a family? And he's literally looked over his shoulder, missed the exit to the airport, and says, did my mom send you or something? Like he was just like, what just happened in this conversation?
Yeah.
The reason I put that story into the book is because I spend a lot of time in the story talking about some of the economic changes that have led to a reduction in marriage. But that story, I think, really illustrates the point that we are at a point in society where this has become so widespread in America that there are folks, again, I don't know how many, but I would put this cab driver in the bucket of, there are folks who are just ambivalent about it, who really don't think twice about how much better off would our daughter be? How much better off would we be as a family if we committed to being together for the long haul and providing our daughter with that stability of two parents in our home, investing in her? And here's where, again, as an economist, if that's an information problem that people just, because we're not honest about this, they don't really recognize, hey, you know what? Those families that you see in society doing really well, whose kids are going to college, most of them, almost all of them, they're raising their kids in two-parent homes. And here's what the data says. Now, are you still ambivalent? And I think there are a lot of people who, if we were more honest and this was a norm that we promoted more, the barriers are not so severe that they actually would make different choices.
You write in the book about that moment, quote, "But the point is that he and his daughter's mom seemed to believe that the options of cohabitating or living apart were more or less equally good when it came to their daughter's well-being. And that is just not what the data say," end quote. And I would recommend to anyone listening to this podcast, Melissa has made many appearances on many different podcasts and shows and forums, and she talks about the data in her book at much greater length than we might talk about here, which is very important. It is a very deeply researched, well thought out, deeply academic book, which I highly recommend to anyone reading it. But I don't know if it's because, I was recently married. I don't know if it's because I've been having these conversations with my mom and my dad, because my wife and I are planning on having a child ASAP. It's just more in the forefront of my mind. So I think while the data is very interesting and it makes the case for what your ultimate prescriptions are, Melissa, what are more interesting are like these little moments, like the moment with the cab driver, because there is a part of me that feels deep down, and this is not dismissing the structural forces that affect all of us in different ways, right? We are all affected by them. But I can't help but feel like when he was flustered, when you talked to him, that he knew that this situation was not more or less equally good for his daughter. Two of my close friends were foster parents, and they were really, really good ones. I think they were the best that any kid in foster care could probably ever ask for. They loved these two girls. But the two girls in their care, especially the older one, who I think was about between the ages of 4 and 6, while they were looking after her sporadically. She was in and out of her parents' custody over that time. I heard story after story from my friends about how much emotional dysregulation that this situation was causing these girls, and how much, especially the older one, the younger one was 1 or 2 years old through most of it, how much the older one yearned for her mom and dad, and how the chaos of not knowing if she'd see her parents like any given week, or what her long-term living situation would be, like how much that affected her, like her mood or self-esteem, like often in ways that, this little girl just didn't even consciously understand. And, my friends, I think they're stronger and better people than me. And I mean that sincerely, because hearing them share these stories and seeing the pain in their faces, Melissa, knowing that the pain was a reflection of the agony that those children were experiencing, I just wanted to find that mom and that dad and just like shake them. You are harming these kids. Like you are hurting these kids every day that you're not with them. I thought of that when I saw that story about the cab driver, because I know deep down, like he knew. He must have known.
Yeah. I'll go back to your anger at the beginning of this conversation. This is why it's so infuriating that policymakers and leaders are too cowardly or dishonest to have this conversation, because you take kids like that and you're like, really? We're just gonna talk about childcare subsidies or hiring some more counselors in schools. You think that's gonna solve this? No, we have to come up with societal norms. We have to come up with programs to help their parents get through whatever they're dealing with. Is it untreated mental health? Is it alcohol addiction? Is it unemployment? What is it? What is it that they need to solve so they could be there for their kids? And why are we reluctant to throw assistance and resources and policy and research energy at the enterprise of strengthening families? And we just keep talking about schools as if we could put more demands on teachers, because those girls are going to go to school and they're going to struggle in school, right? No matter what your friends do, they're going to struggle because internally they're hurting and they're distracted. And there's going to be some school counselor. And that's our solution? Like, that's not going to work. And it's unfair to the kids.
Yes. Yes. We are already asking teachers enough to teach. I think putting more onto their plate is not a good idea.
One of the really bolstering reactions I've gotten to the book, which has in some sense emboldened me more to just be out there saying things like this, is I've gotten so many emails from teachers and pediatricians who were like, yes, exactly. This is what I've seen happening in my office, in my classroom over the past 20 years, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. Like if I bring it up with my principal, it's shot down. This is not something pediatricians want to talk about. But people who work with the young people in this country, they are seeing this. They're seeing the effect it has on kids. And so their sort of stories and outreach and gratitude for me, like calling this out with data as a policy matter, is also really bolstering.
I imagine it has to be. And I want to loop back to something you said, because I think this is important. In the moment when I hear stories like the ones that my friend shared, or, I read the story about the cab driver, like my first gut reaction is anger. My mind immediately goes to the child. But it's important to keep your perspective, which is, okay, we can understand that this is not the best situation for the child. We can even make a judgment about the behavior of the parent. But at the end of the day, we have to find ways to empower the adults, to empower them to make better choices that ultimately help the child. It can't just be anger and shame. We have to find ways that we can empower people to make choices that maybe even subconsciously they know, or consciously they know that they need to make, but maybe don't have the tools or understanding of how to make those choices. And I think that that's an important focus you have in the book.
I mean, there's also a lot of those parents didn't grow up in stable two-parent homes. There is a huge intergenerational transmission mechanism happening here. This is why it's so imperative to break it. And this, by the way, comes back to the crisis that Richard Reeves has pointed out, which is that boys are falling behind. Now, where Richard and I somewhat diverge is I put a lot of emphasis on the fact that boys are falling behind in large part because millions of them are growing up without dads in their home. And we know from evidence that growing up without a dad in your home is particularly disadvantageous for boys. It's bad for both boys and girls, but in terms of hitting educational marks, not getting in trouble, not getting involved in the criminal justice system, the disadvantage is greater for boys. So you have these boys growing up in those situations. They don't have role models in their home about how to be a good provider or father. And then what happens? 24, they get their girlfriend pregnant. They're not in a good position. So this is going to repeat across the generations if we don't break it.
Oh, yes. And this is anecdata, but I wanted to share some of the YouTube comments that I saw underneath some of the podcasts that you appeared on.
Oh my gosh, this is so funny. I've never read any of them. Now I'm nervous.
I wouldn't be nervous. I don't think you'll find it heartening, but I think you'll find that it confirms what we've been talking about here. Quote, I'm a therapist in the Midwest running drug treatment groups. About once a month, I take a poll and ask, everyone who grew up without a dad, raise your hand. And it's about 80 to 90%, end quote. Another person wrote, quote, as someone who has worked in the law enforcement/corrections career field, I would say that more than 80% of offenders come from single-parent households. If you want to reduce crime and other societal problems, the single-parent mindset needs to stop, end quote. Quote, as a child of a single mom and an old-school latchkey kid, I can say with 100% certainty all of the problems I dealt with as a kid into my 20s, and I mean all, were the result of no dad in the home. Now being the father of two kids, 16 and 12, married for 20 years, it's even more apparent what my kids are getting that I did not have, end quote. That's 3 out of, we could spend 4 hours reading comments like that, Melissa.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know. I mean, I love it because the stories are really powerful. And as you said, my book is, I think it's accessible. It's not too much data, but look, those anecdotes, we see them in nationally representative data sets. We see them in the census data, right? We see them in the data on households that track how kids do. But people telling their stories and how they experienced it in their own life, I think that's what makes it come alive and makes it really imperative for us to make this a priority for our society to address.
What is the data ultimately, but really a kind of collection of all these many, many, many stories into a data point, right? I mean, what is a forest if not thousands of trees? So it makes sense that these stories that these people are sharing and the data align because the data is ultimately just a collection of all of their narratives.
One narrative that I want to bring up that we haven't talked about yet. So a very skeptical reaction to this line of sort of policy promotion that I'm pushing, which is we need to invest in families, is the Bush administration tried some healthy marriage initiatives and they didn't work. And so, we're done. And I have many reactions to that. One is, do you know how many training programs or education interventions this country has tried over the past 40 years that didn't work? We don't give up on workers or students. We keep trying and we keep innovating and we see what works. So it's true that these marriage initiatives that were funded by the Bush administration in the early 2000s, they didn't lead to increased rates. And so I am guilty of being one of those people for a long time was like, the government doesn't know how to help people achieve marriage or raise their kids in two-parent homes. Like, there's nothing we can do. And then this wonderful ethnographer Sarah Halpern Beacon, she's at Wisconsin. She interviewed a bunch of the low-income couples who took advantage of these free programs. And just hearing their stories was really interesting because it was easy for us, those of us who looked at the data and the evidence and said, oh, it did increase in rates of marriage, that program didn't work. But when she interviewed the couples, what she heard was they want to figure out how to make their relationships work. I think it was like only 1 out of 31 of them grew up in a married parent home. Their friends aren't married. They're not surrounded by people who have healthy, sustaining relationships. And they were looking for help. And so that really changed my thoughts on these programs, which is not that, oh, this line of sort of program innovations is doomed to fail, but like maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe giving someone an 8-week relationship course after they grew up in a dysfunctional home, they're surrounded by people who don't model what a healthy marriage looks like, that's probably not enough. Again, who's a champion of equity and equality is okay with the fact that higher income people who want their relationships to work, they can pay for therapy, they do all sorts of things. But these vulnerable couples, even ones with kids who want to figure out how to have healthy relationships, they didn't see it modeled growing up. They don't see it modeled in their community. They're looking for skills. Who wouldn't want to fund programs to help them?
And I think Americans have always had a soft spot for wanting to help people who want to help themselves. Understanding that a lot of these people are just doing the best they can with bad or incomplete or broken information, I think can help reframe. And again, it can be tough to hear about the stories of these children and not just lash out in anger. But when you understand it from the point of view of some folks, I have my own issues, right? Even though my parents did a wonderful job raising my sister and I, there are certain things they didn't know that they couldn't pass on to me because they weren't exposed to it as children. And so there are things, whether it's about income investment, just other things in life growing up as an adult that I kind of had to struggle to learn on my own because it wasn't passed down through no fault of their own. They were doing the best that they could. But before we get to your policy prescriptions, which I think are great, there was something that you wrote in the book that stood out to me because it kind of blew up what I thought was a correct stat, but is actually incorrect. It's almost a meme at this point. I imagine all of us have heard it 1,000 times. Almost 50% of all marriages in the United States will end in divorce. Now, some people say it's a little bit lower, like closer to 40% of all marriages. But you say in this book that divorce isn't what's driving the decline in marriage and rise in single-parent households. You write actually that divorce is down. So I guess my question is, what is causing the divorce rate to go down? Is it just the reproductive technology that we talked about earlier? And where does this 50% of all marriages meme come from?
That meme is outdated. It's just not true anymore. It's actually harder than you'd think to sort of track the share of marriages that end in divorce, but it's not 50% anymore. And the reason why divorce is down is because so many fewer people are getting married. There's a couple things that are really surprising. How do we get to this position where 40% of births in the US are outside of marriage? That is astounding, 40%, okay? How did we get there? It's really because of the decoupling of marriage from having kids. It's because of a reduction in marriage. And so even if you look at unpartnered mothers who are not cohabiting with a partner, who are not married, in 1980, only 22% of them were never married. Now 52% of them were never married. And if you just look at less educated women or Black or Hispanic women, the shares are much higher. But it's quite striking that now a small majority of unpartnered mothers have never been married. So that is really what's driving this, a reduction in marriage, not an increase in divorce. So when you realize how many fewer people are getting married in the first place, even among those who have kids together, then it becomes less surprising that divorce is down. Because the people who are getting married, again, let's focus on the college educated, they're the ones who are most likely to get married now. They're more committed to the institution from the get-go. So once you realize that's what's happening, it makes more sense to realize divorce is down. The other thing that's really surprising is that this increase in non-marital childbearing, which ultimately results in kids living with only one parent, this has happened despite a dramatic reduction in teen childbearing. Teen childbearing is way down. It's down over 70% from the mid-90s. If you told me in the mid-90s that teen childbearing was essentially going to fall off a cliff like this in the US, I think many others who study these kinds of trends would have predicted that single motherhood would also decrease.
There were 3 things that I remember hearing about as a kid in the 90s that are now no longer a problem. 1 was the ozone layer, 2 was acid rain, and 3 was teen pregnancies. And they're all just gone, more or less.
Well, teen childbearing is still hard for the teens who have a kid and their kids. But right, it's not a major challenge anymore in the sense that the rates are super low. In fact, births to all women under the age of 30 are low, which is actually raising its own challenges, but that's a topic for a different podcast. But what's happened is a doubling in the share of births that are unmarried. Again, up the age and education distribution. And here too, if you think about births to college-educated moms, 11% of them are outside marriage. That's a doubling from 40 years ago, but it's still just 11%. Among women with a high school degree but not a four-year college degree, it's 52%. And then women without a high school degree, it's 66%. There's also major differences across racial and ethnic groups. So 70% of children born to moms who identify in the census as Black, 70% of those births are outside marriage, as compared to 29% among whites, which again is nearly a doubling in 40 years, but it's still much lower than that for Blacks. And among the Asians, it's 18%. So, if we're thinking about racial and ethnic differences and all this, kids in the U.S. born to moms who identify as ethnically Asian, they're the most likely to be growing up with married parents. And that's actually true regardless of education level.
It's weird, right? Because I can feel myself tensing up as I'm about to ask you this question. But in the spirit of your courage, Melissa, I'm going to ask it. Doesn't the fact that Asian Americans have higher rates of marriage than any other racial cohort, regardless of income and educational attainment, say that there's a cultural element there that maybe we should look to? Understandably, I think Americans are a little bit hesitant to talk about this stuff because it's uncomfortable, because I think there's a feeling like you're saying, oh, this group is less than, this group is more valuable, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to clarify that that's not what I'm saying. What I do want to say, though, is in the same way that when I was a kid and I saw one of my peers, just one kid, doing better in a class than me, and I would go to him and I would say, hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing better in this math class? Or why are you doing better in this history class? It never came down to him being intrinsically, genetically better than me. It would come down to he was just studying in a way or writing in a way. There was something that he was doing that I could mimic, that I could also adapt, that would make me do better in that class. And so I guess when I'm asking this question, I'm trying to unload it from the baggage that we have when we talk about these cultural differences among groups. Is there anything that you've looked to or your colleagues have looked to where they can say, hey, it's not because they're ethnically Asian that they have higher marriage rates. It's not that. But there must be something that's happening within that group that makes it so these marriages are more prominent across different economic strata within Asian Americans.
By the way, this was a surprise to me when I did the research for the book. This wasn't something that I knew, because most of the research in economics and sociology, psychology on family differences really focused on Black-white differences. Now Hispanics and Asians are a sufficiently large share of the population that we have nationally representative data on them. So I added them into all of the data work I did in the book. And so this Asian finding was new to me. And I went looking, and of course, people who study Asian American communities, they knew this. And I think you're exactly right that the explanation is largely a cultural one. And then if you look across countries in the world, which, by the way, to be clear, the U.S. has the highest share of kids growing up in a one-parent house among 130 countries for which there's data. But the rates of single parenthood are exceedingly low in Asian countries. And so that seems to be a cultural social norm that ethnic group is bringing and holding on to in the U.S. Now, once we eliminate recent immigrants, you do see some convergence to non-immigrant populations, but not to any great extent. So in any case, yes, there are things that make some home environments more conducive to student success and to kids' educational and economic success. Raising kids in a married parent household is one of them. This is really interesting. Ian Rowe has picked up on this, and he has promoted the following fact, which is in the U.S., we don't even report, the education department doesn't report data by family structure.
Wow.
How often do you hear about test score gaps and education gaps by race and ethnic groups?
Why don't they do that?
You can speculate as well as I can, but they don't report it. And so that is something where he's like, can we look at the data by family structure? Because again, how much of these are racial gaps versus family structure gaps.
Right.
If we really want to help kids, we have to know where the disadvantage is coming from, right? And what elements of it.
Right. If the only data we have is racial, we'll make the assumption that the difference is racial when it could be another cause that we just don't understand because we don't have the data for it.
Yeah, we don't have the data for it. I think that's pretty interesting. I have a chapter in the book on parenting to try and just, again, draw on research to say, what is it about two-parent houses that would be so helpful for kids? And, I take a resource-based framework to it, unsurprisingly, since I'm an economist, but it's not just money. Money is a big part of it. The median married parent household has twice as much income as the typical single parent household. And these differences exist even when you look at married and single parent households of the same education level, the same race. Having two adults in the house with the capacity to bring in money, very unsurprisingly, brings in more money. And that's very helpful to kids in this country. It means they live in different neighborhoods. They have more money spent on their education, their quality childcare, their enrichment activities, all sorts of things. But it's not even just money, because once you statistically control for family income, we know that there are still large gaps. And, the two buckets of other types of resources that I present evidence are just time. If you have two parents spending their time supervising you, reading to you, helping you with your homework, driving you to your sports, that's all very beneficial. And then I also talk about emotional bandwidth. And I think this gets into some of the things you're talking about in terms of family stability and kids feeling safe and nurtured. If there are two parents in the household, there's lower levels of stress. I mean, again, unsurprisingly, if you were doing the really hard job of raising kids alone, responsible for paying the bills, making the meals, helping them with their homework, there's a high level of stress. And you've mentioned hopefully becoming a parent soon. It will be immediately obvious that when you're tired at the end of the workday, when there's something stressing you out, it's really freaking hard to just parent your kid the way the parenting books say you're supposed to and be unyieldingly patient and read to them. Of course, it's harder to do if this is a single parent household. And so there's lots of, we could say these choices to raise your kid in a two-parent home is consequential. And then I'm trying to show there are a lot of obvious, but also documented mechanisms through which that happens.
You lay out 4 policy prescriptions at the end of your book, things that you think that could help increase marriage rates, decrease this class divide. I want to just focus on one of them. You write, quote, scale up government and community programs that show promise in strengthening families and improving outcomes for parents and children from disadvantaged backgrounds, end quote. And I would love for you to share what that government or community program might look like. Going back to what you were saying, Melissa, about there's been a lot of government programs out there that just haven't worked, that have failed in their mission to change the outcome of Americans' lives. What have you seen from your research that could work, that we could look to and say, this could really help solve this problem?
I have to say, I'm super excited about this is where I'm going to spend a lot of time over the next 6 months trying to work on this. And I'm going to be on leave at Notre Dame University, which is setting up a research center focused on strengthening families. And what we're going to be doing as part of that center is pulling together researchers from different disciplines with community practitioners and service providers to design and study these kinds of programs that work with families. And actually, just when I get off this call with you, I have a Zoom call with an organization that pulls together a lot of these groups to start the brainstorming of what kind of interventions and programs to study. Really interestingly, the Department of Defense runs a bunch of programs aimed at helping families because they know military families struggle. There's moves, there's PTSD. And so the Department of Defense runs a lot of these innovative programs aimed at helping families have healthy, sustained relationships. So we'll be looking at some of those. There's a lot of responsible fatherhood programs that work with non-custodial dads. Again, I'm looking for promising programs because many of these will show the ones that have been tested or evaluated, they show some signs of promise in the sense that after going through a program, the dads know better how to engage with their children in age-appropriate ways. Maybe they've come up with better ways of resolving parenting conflicts with the mother of the child. None of them that I've seen yet have had major effects that we would say, yes, we need to scale this around the country. But again, I think a lot of it is because the research and evidence in this space is still developing. And I think we're still learning collectively the various types of barriers or hesitations that some of these vulnerable couples are dealing with and the right way to design these holistic programs.
Going back to the beginning of this conversation, when I mentioned Richard Reeves, your colleague at the Brookings Institution, he was driven to write his book of Boys and Men because he saw a problem in society that no one else was really talking about or was afraid to talk about and decided to write a book about it because he cared about social inequality. But also, he wrote the book because he was a father to 3 boys. And so he saw in them the issue manifest. And similarly, you dedicated your book to your 3 children. In the acknowledgments, you write, quote, "And with all my heart, I am grateful to my 3 children, William, Sophia, and Adelaide, for forgiving my parenting fails and for bringing joy and love beyond measure. The 3 of them are my sun, my moon, and my shining stars. There is nothing I am more grateful for in this world." And so I would just ask you, what role did they play in you deciding to write this book?
See, now you're going to make me cry. They played a huge role. Like that says, I would do anything in the world for them. And so would my husband. And, we're not perfect parents. We mess up plenty, but we give everything we can to them. And I want all kids to have that. I want all kids to have 2 parents who are unfailing and unconditional in just doing their best to provide for their kids. And by the way, as a mom, I'm also really empathetic to the parents. I mean, parenting is really hard, and I can't imagine having to do it myself. And so I'm grateful for that privilege. And that's something else. I want other parents to have the support of a second committed co-parent. So yeah, my kids are. Once you see the world through the eyes of a kid, there seems to be nothing more important than trying to advocate for all children.
Melissa, as an academic who dedicates her life to lessening social inequality, as an author who wrote such a deeply researched and thoughtful and measured book, and as a mother who clearly cares so deeply for her children, thank you for what you do, and thank you for your time today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk with you.